Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about the 1938 screwball comedy classic, Bringing Up Baby. This was a Howard Hawks movie. It stars Katherine Hepburn, Cary Grant, a leopard, a dog, Asta, by the way. This is actually Asta from The Thin Man. It just came out this week on the Criterion Collection. I picked it up Tuesday. Today is Thursday, so I've had a chance to watch the movie again for the first time in couple of years, maybe. I usually see it at least once a year. It's a screwball comedy unlike any other screwball comedy. It's so zany. It's sort of like a screwball upon screwball upon screwball situation. I would say it's almost, in that sense at least, it's a kind of an experimental movie in the sense of how far can we go with this screwball. It's kind of an alternate universe. It's kind of going through the rabbit hole. It was not a hit movie. Howard Hawks, the director, was used to making hit movies, but it was not the disaster that it's often referred to. It did, and a lot of that is because it only played a week in Radio City Music Hall, but it did very well in other big cities across the country. It got mixed reviews, but mostly positive. I read Otis Ferguson was one of the great film critics of that era, whose reviews have been collected in an old book I have, and I was pleased to see. I sort of remembered that he liked the movie, and he did. And it got excellent review. It previewed well. Audiences laughed at it, but it got a reputation that it was not a very good movie. Most of the negative reviews and its reputation is due to this idea that Katherine Hepburn was box office poison, that audiences didn't like her. After I see, how could audiences not like Katherine Hepburn, and especially in the 1930s? I mean, she was so good. She didn't know how to do screwball comedy. She had never done this, and Walter Catlett, who plays Constable Slocum, was an old hand at this type of comedy. So Hawks had her work with him for a while to get comfortable with this kind of style of comedy. But Hawks attributed the sense that it was not a hit to the fact that it is too zany. It's just there isn't any sense of reality to the movie. Every character is zany. Every situation is zany. I read Todd McCarthy's biography of Hawks a couple years ago, and I was amazed that after Bringing Up Baby, I think starting with Sergeant York, Hawks had like at least 12 movies, I think, in a row that were, top 10 box office, most of them top 5. I know Sergeant York was number 1. He was a hit maker, and he judged his movies by, did they do well with audiences? But in the 1950s, along with movies like The Wizard of Oz and there was a few others. It's a Wonderful Life was not received well in its time. They were shown on television in the 50s. I know my family just loved Bringing Up Baby, and the movie became a classic. So Hawks lived long enough to see this movie that he thought was a failure become a classic, and despite his misgivings about it, and it was one of the movies he was asked about the most by the end of his life. And right from the opening scene, we get just great. And the opening scene is rather quiet, but it starts with a double entendre. And I know when I was a kid, I missed this one, but Miss Swallow, who is Cary Grant, David Huxley's fiance, he is a paleontologist. He's putting together a brontosaurus. It looks like it's almost complete. He's sitting on a scaffold next to the brontosaurus with a bone in his hand, and he says, Alice, Miss Swallow, says, I think this one belongs in the tail. Miss Swallow says, nonsense, David. You tried it in the tail last night. It didn't fit. and then also, as part of this conversation, this opening scene, Cary Grant is trying to get $1 million donation from a rich donor, and for the museum, for his work. he's going to play around the golf with the lawyer who represents this donor. Miss Swallow Alice says, "Be sure you're on your best behavior," with Mr. Peabody, the lawyer. And Cary Grant says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll wow him, I'll knock him for a loop." And Miss Swallow says, "Oh, David, no slang. Remember who and what you are." And that's really the key line in the film, because David loses all track of who and what he is. He becomes Mr. Bone, and by the end of the movie, he becomes Jerry the Nipper, a gangster. All this coming from the fertile imagination and the improvisational skills of Susan Vance, who, as it turns out, is the niece of this donor. Mrs. Carlton Random is the one giving away the $1 million. A leopard is involved. A leopard is sent from Mrs. Carlton Random's nephew, a tame leopard. Susan Vance doesn't know that, and then the leopard gets away. They're out in Connecticut. She drags David Huxley into all her adventures. They're crazy. He can't be who he really is, because he doesn't want Mrs. Carlton Random to know, because he's been acting crazy. Not only is his name changing, his gender changes. Susan absconds with his clothing. He has to dress in a woman's negligee, and that's the first time he meets this donor who's about to give $1 million. And she said, "Well, who are you? What's the matter with you?" And he jumps up in the air and says, I don't know. I've suddenly gone gay." One of the classic moments in the film. And no one else could do that, could get away with that. No movie star in Hollywood could get away with that except for Cary Grant. But by the end of the movie, there's a nighttime escapade through the forest. George has gone off. George the dog has absconded with the last bone that's just been mailed to David, the intercostal clavicle. George has buried it somewhere on this vast estate, and they go hunting for the escaped leopard. They go hunting for George, because they need George to find the bone, the missing intercostal clavicle. Even the leopard has an identity crisis, because there's two leopards. There's this tame leopard, and then there's this circus leopard who's gone bad and is ferocious. So it's a surreal kind of escapade. It's really one of the greatest sequences, I think, in Howard Hawks' movies. Riverbeds change. They fall down cliffs. Cary Grant gets when they fall down this embankment, Cary Grant emerges with a butterfly net over his head. But by the end, he realizes he's had fun, and this is what I think Hawks is getting at. Bringing Up Baby is kind of Howard Hawks' ode to joy, to be a kid, to have fun. And he does this in Ball of Fire, too, a movie he made a couple years later. Gary Cooper plays a professor who's writing an encyclopedia, and he gets involved with a gangster's maul played by Barbara Stanwyck, who also leads him into outside the ivory tower into the real world, where he and his co-workers on this encyclopedia have a lot of fun and a lot of adventures. So, and you don't really need to know any of that. The movie is funny. I think that both Grant and Hepburn are absolutely hilarious, and all the supporting Charlie Ruggles is Major Applegate, who loses track of his name. Maybe he's Major Apple Tree, so I mean, there's funny stuff, and it's classic. And like I say, it's almost surreal in its compounding of zaniness. Now in the extras, we have audio. There's in this edition, this Criterion edition of Bringing Up Baby, has a ton of supplements. There's an audio interview with Howard Hawks that was conducted by Peter Bogdanovich. There's one with Cary Grant, type of, I guess he appears before an audience and they ask him questions. The standard kind of questions and answers in these interviews. There's a 1977 German documentary filmed a month before Howard Hawks died. It's called A Hell of a Good Life. So I think they spent 5 days with Howard Hawks. He was 81 at the time, and he's still just driving around. He's certainly not, he looks a bit frail. Hawks wasn't the greatest interview. He would talk very slowly. He was very unforthcoming. He loved to emphasize that he was not an artist. He was just a storyteller, as if there's no art to telling stories well. Then we get the Peter Bogdanovich commentary that comes over from the DVD. I think it was from like maybe 2005. I didn't like that commentary. It's one of the worst I've ever heard on a major film. And he indulges, some of the questions and answers were transcribed from this audio interview that we have with Howard Hawks. And of course, Bogdanovich loves to imitate, so we have to listen to Bogdanovich imitating Howard Hawks quite a bit. And some of the other stuff, he just repeats lines. Oh, this is so funny. Certainly, for a movie that had never come out on Blu-ray and was highly anticipated by a large fan base, you would think that Criterion could have found somebody to do film historian or something, a screwball comedy expert, to do a commentary on this, because there really isn't much in the way of an academic. Maybe Criterion feels that this isn't really a movie meant for academia. Then we have a bunch of new features, new supplements. One is on costume designer Howard Greer, who designed the clothing and some of the clothing for Katherine Hepburn. Some of her costumes are really involved, and that's pretty good. And then we have a feature on Linwood Dunn. Linwood Dunn did the photo optics on this film, and he doesn't get credit for it though, because the department head gets the credit in the opening credits. But Linwood Dunn was an expert in optical printing. He even he popularized it. He even built optical printers that he sold to all the other studios a few years later. And of course, this was a tricky movie to do, because you had to create the impression that the leopard was in the same scenes with the actors. So they would mask the left-hand side of the frame, have the actors in the right-hand side, and then they would print the activities of the leopard in the left-hand side that had been masked to make it look like they were in the same shot. But the leopard actually was in the same shot early on with Katherine Hepburn, and she was fearless. Leopard wanders around her. She's wearing one of these costumes, and they had put some weights down on the bottom of the costume to make it fuller to make it look better for the camera. And when she got up, they jingled around, and the leopard got spooked and jumped on her back. The trainer was right there, and to get her away. But that was the last time they took the chance of having the leopard in too close proximity to the actors. So we see how they got around it with the optical printing. And they used plexiglass. Like there's a scene where Cary Grant opens the bathroom door, and there's the leopard in the same frame, same half of the frame. So they show you how they had put a plexiglass, and which they used in a couple of other scenes as well. There is a scene towards the end where they're pulling the leopard by a rope, and so they have Katherine Hepburn, and then the blank screen on the right, and then they shoot the leopard with the trainer pulling the rope, but then they had to match it, and which was almost impossible to do, to synchronize this tiny little rope. So you can catch that there. They also used a puppet. I had never noticed in the jailhouse scene at the end of the film. They actually had a puppet of a leopard. Another interesting little tidbit, where the brontosaurus, the room where the brontosaurus is being put together by Cary Grant, there's some props around of dinosaurs, and these were actual models that were used for King Kong a few years earlier. This is the same studio, RKO. Then we have John Bailey discussing the cinematographer Russell Meddy. It was kind of early in Meddy's career, but it also goes very heavy into Howard Hawks' visual style, which was always leaned towards eye level. What you see on the screen is what you would see if you were actually in the room itself. And he shows the kind of depth that Hawks and Mehdi were going for to give you that illusion that you're actually there. And that was the standard style of Hawks. And it was a style that he was so consistent with, you'd have to say this is a style. And he had been at Fox when F.W. Murnau came to Fox, and William Fox was so impressed by Murnau, he wanted all his directors to make films like, and both John Ford and Howard Hawks made a film. Hawks did not want to go on that. That was not the route. He didn't like all these dark effects, and he wanted a clear image with a focus on the actors at all time, and he didn't want the audience to notice that there was even a camera. And Russell Mehdi went on to a terrific career. He worked mostly for Universal and did all of Douglas Sirk's great masterpieces in the 1950s. He did Touch of Evil with Orson Welles, which is Touch of Evil coming out in 4K UHD later this year. And he'd also worked with Welles on The Stranger. Then we get a video essay by Scott Eyman, and this is on Cary Grant's career, his early career, leading up to Bring Up Baby. And this is really good. I think it runs almost a half an hour, and he really goes into the detail of Grant had been around on getting small parts in A movies. He was the lead in really bad B movies. He wasn't the Cary Grant that we have come to know and remember, the Cary Grant persona. He made a couple movies with Marlene Dietrich and Joseph von Sternberg, but of course von Sternberg's whole focus was on Marlene Dietrich. He made a couple films with Mae West, and of course Cary Grant was sort of the eye candy. All the good stuff was saved for Mae West. But his previous film, Cary Grant's previous film, To Bring Up Baby, was The Awful Truth with Leo McCarey, which was a big hit. It was a romantic comedy with screwball moments, and McCarey knew what actors were, and he was the one who really brought to the fore what we remember as Cary Grant. And Howard Hawks was very impressed by it. He loved the physical comedy that Grant could do, and like I said earlier, nobody would have ever done any of this kind of stuff in a movie except for Cary Grant. Then we get a booklet, and there's a great shot on the cover of the butterfly net that's soon to go over Cary Grant's face. He's wearing glasses, and it's one of the few times he ever wore glasses, and Howard Hawks wanted him to wear the glasses, and these are Harold Lloyd type glasses, and he wanted Harold Lloyd was still a very familiar figure. From his to audiences in 1938 from his silent film days, and Hawks wanted to get that Harold Lloyd look into Grant. Of course, right in this scene here, right after this scene, Katherine Hepburn accidentally breaks those glasses, so he not even knows who he is. He can't really see what's going on around him. So there's a essay by Sheila O'Malley, and there's also the original story by Hager Wilde. She had written this story for Collier magazine. Hawks had read it. They do change. I mean, it's very changed around. It's mostly dialogue, but I was surprised to see that some of the dialogue in the short story is in the movie. And she worked on the screenplay with Dudley Nichols, who was mostly a dramatic screenwriter. He had recently made The Informer with John Ford. I'm sure he was there to give it some shape, and Hawks himself loved to improvise, loved to find new ideas on the sets from the actors, and he had such an incredible supporting cast of experienced comic actors here. It's just a wonderful movie. Like I say, I've seen that some of the Barnes and Nobles around me have gone out of stock already, but I'm sure there's more on the way, but obviously a highly recommended film by me. So I went a little bit longer than I normally do, but it's a movie I could probably talk about for another hour. But for everyone who stuck with me to this point, thanks a lot. You guys take care, and I will catch you next time.